What changes when there are no passengers to protect? The freight world runs on older aircraft and thinner margins, with tired crews flying through the night on schedules nobody would accept in a passenger cabin. The rules that surround your flight grow very quiet out here. In this video, we look at what that costs in the cargo planes that burned in the air or never made it off the runway. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. When the first officer applied to fly for Atlas Air, he left 2 airlines off his work history. At both, he had quit training partway through without finishing. He said he had spent those years selling real estate and going back to university. Nobody caught it, because the system for checking a pilot's past depended entirely on the pilot listing every place he had worked. He was hired, and 18 months later, he flew a wide-body jet into a bay in Texas. That afternoon, he sat in the right seat of a Boeing 767 freighter painted in Amazon colors, loaded with parcels on the short run from Miami to Houston. Beside him was a 60-year-old captain. Behind them, riding in the jump seat, was a third pilot who had just been offered his dream job at a major airline and was flying home to see his family before starting it. They were descending through cloud with thunderstorms scattered around them when the controller asked them to hurry down. To lose height faster, the first officer pulled out the speed brakes, then kept his left hand on the lever so he would not forget to stow them. That lever sits on the captain's side of the console, and reaching across, put his wrist directly beneath the throttles. A jolt of turbulence pushed his wrist up into a small button under one throttle, the switch that commands a go-around. The engines began to spool up and the nose lifted gently. The captain had his head down, programming the approach, and never saw the mode indicators change. The first officer felt the acceleration and thought nothing of it. Then, his own body betrayed him. Sealed in cloud with no horizon, his inner ear had nothing to work with. When a person accelerates forward, the push into the seatback feels exactly like tipping backward. And with no visual reference, the brain cannot tell the two apart. Every pilot is trained to defeat this illusion by looking at the attitude indicator. He never looked. 7 seconds after the switch was bumped, convinced the nose was rearing up toward a stall, he shoved the control column forward. His instruments were showing a perfectly normal attitude. He shouted about his airspeed, baffled that it was rising when he believed the aircraft was about to stall. His sustained push disconnected the autopilot, and the 767 tipped into a dive of nearly 50 degrees from 6,000 feet. Only now did the captain look up. He saw the dive and hauled back on his column, but in the shock of it, he never said out loud that he was taking control. So the first officer kept pushing while the captain kept pulling, the two of them fighting each other over a jet falling out of the sky. The overspeed warning began to clack. From the jump seat, the third pilot shouted at them to pull up. At that moment, the aircraft dropped below the cloud base and the water appeared ahead. The illusion broke instantly and the first officer pulled with everything he had. It was far too late. The 767 struck the shallows of Trinity Bay at more than 400 knots and was reduced to fragments, some driven 3 meters down into the mud. All 3 men died on impact. Divers took more than a week to find the recorders in that estuary, and what they held made the sequence plain. The harder question was how a trained airline pilot could do this at all, so investigators went through his records, and what they found was appalling. He had failed to complete training at 2 airlines. At another, he failed an oral exam and then a check ride. He failed an attempt to upgrade to captain. He failed his 767 type rating exam. Instructors described among the worst piloting ability they had ever seen. A man who panicked and pressed buttons at random when something surprised him, and who blamed every failure on somebody else. None of it reached Atlas Air, because the 2 airlines he never mentioned were the ones that would have revealed the pattern. There was supposed to be a safeguard. After a fatal crash a decade earlier, Congress had ordered the Aviation Authority to build a searchable database of every pilot's employment record, precisely so no applicant could bury his history. The deadline was April of 2017, a few months before this man was hired. The authority missed it. Years after this aircraft went into Trinity Bay, the database still was not finished. One investigator put the lesson bluntly, that anyone who finds a proper background check expensive should try having an accident instead. The instrument at the heart of this crash was never broken. That was the cruelest part. A perfectly good attitude indicator was pulled from the cockpit, taken apart, put back together, and signed off as repaired, while the component actually feeding it bad information sat untouched a few feet away. The fault had first appeared earlier that same day. Climbing out of Tashkent, the previous captain banked his Boeing 747 to the right and watched his artificial horizon roll a few degrees and then simply stop. He handled it exactly as a pilot should. He compared his instrument against the other 2. handed control to his first officer, and worked through the checklist. Flipping one switch changed the data source feeding his display, and the fault vanished. He wrote it up in the technical log at Stansted in plain language. The airline's ground engineer there had 20 years of experience. What he did not have was the manual explaining what the fault code meant, because his copy was in Moscow. The evidence pointed at the navigation unit supplying the data. He decided instead that the display itself was to blame. He pulled it out, found a connector pin pushed slightly back, and became certain he had found the culprit. A local avionics engineer was called in to reseat it. Nobody told that man what the original fault had been, and he never asked. He finished a job he had not started. They pressed the test button and the display swung obediently through its full range. It proved nothing. The built-in test never touched the data coming from the navigation unit, the only thing that had ever been wrong. The engineer signed the log, boarded the aircraft as a passenger for the next leg, and everyone believed the problem was solved. The new crew arrived to a chain of small aggravations. Their flight plan had never reached the tower. The tug that came to push them back broke down halfway through the job. By the time they were cleared to taxi, they were an hour late, and the captain had begun snapping at his first officer, a man with 73 hours on the type, over how he spoke on the radio. Then the equipment measuring their distance from the airport gave a nonsense reading, and the captain fixed on it. A left turn was required at a precise distance after takeoff, and turning late meant breaking the local noise rules. They rolled at 36 minutes past 6 on a dark December evening. The 747 lifted off and climbed straight, and at 900 feet, a warning chimed to say the two attitude indicators disagreed with each other. The captain began his turn to the left. His own display stayed stubbornly level. He kept rolling, waiting for a picture that was never going to move, and outside, there was nothing but blackness to tell him otherwise. Behind him, the flight engineer saw it immediately. He called out that the bank was wrong. Nobody answered. He said it again. Somebody reached over and silenced the warning as though it were an annoyance. The jet passed 45 degrees of bank, then 60, while the captain talked about the turn and the distance and the noise rules. The engineer tried once more to point at the standby instrument. No one replied. At 80 degrees, the wings gave up and the nose fell. The captain's display now showed a steep dive, and neither pilot reacted. The first officer, taking a radio call at the critical moment, may never have looked up at all. Simulations later showed there had been 13 seconds in which the wings could still have been leveled. 13 seconds is a long time for an experienced crew. It is almost nothing for a new first officer deciding whether to seize the controls from a captain who has already humiliated him once that evening. 56 seconds after takeoff, the aircraft struck an embankment beside a pond outside a small English village and disintegrated. All four aboard died instantly, the three pilots and the engineer who had signed off the repair. Investigators arriving the next morning detected radiation across the site and evacuated it, until the airline confirmed the cargo had included radioactive iodine bound for medical equipment. Scattered by the impact and far too thin to harm anyone. The last words on the recorder belonged to the flight engineer, who spent his final moments knowing exactly what was happening and unable to make anyone listen. For years afterward, a popular American book explained this crash to millions of readers as a parable about the national culture the pilots came from, a theory that fell apart under any real scrutiny. The truth was closer to home. An airline had grown faster than it could train people, inside a culture where the captain was treated as something close to a god. Afterward, it rebuilt that culture from the ground up, and it has never had another fatal accident since. By the time the fire alarm rang, the fire had probably been burning for 10 or 15 minutes. That is what investigators eventually concluded, and it is the most frightening detail of the whole accident. The pallets were wrapped in plastic rain covers, so the smoke pooled underneath them and the detectors saw nothing. The two pilots cruising high above the Persian Gulf had no idea anything was wrong until the blaze beneath them was near its peak. They were flying a Boeing 747 freighter in from Hong Kong and 20 minutes out of Dubai on the next leg to Germany. Somewhere in that cargo sat at least 80,000 lithium batteries, several tons altogether, packed in among phones and laptop power supplies by shippers who label their own boxes. The airline had no practical way to see inside a plastic-wrapped pallet, and many of those shipments were not labeled correctly at all. Nobody knows which battery failed first. Once one of them overheated, the ones around it caught as well, and the reaction spread in a chain that nothing on board could stop. A lithium fire burns hotter than 2,000 degrees. Halon smothers the flames without stopping the reaction, so the fire returns as soon as the gas disperses. The 747 had no fire suppression on its main deck at all, only a system for venting air out of the hold, and against this, it was useless. 21 minutes into the flight, the bell sounded. The captain took the controls, and told Bahrain he had a main deck fire and needed to land at once. Bahrain offered him Doha, 100 miles off his left wing. He turned back toward Dubai instead, farther away but familiar and already in the computer. Investigators spent years on that choice before concluding it changed almost nothing. The fire reached the flight controls in under 3 minutes. A 747 moves its elevators through long steel cables running back to the tail, and heat makes steel cables go slack. The captain pushed his control column forward and felt the aircraft barely respond. He said aloud that he had almost no control, and moments later that he had none. Smoke was already filling the cockpit. One air conditioning pack had failed earlier in the climb, and a step in the fire checklist switched off the other two, leaving nothing to hold clean air forward and push the fumes back. When the captain opened the smoke evacuation shutter, it pulled even more smoke in. Within minutes, neither man could read his instruments. He did one thing that mattered enormously. He turned the autopilot back on. The autopilot does not use the cables. It sends electrical signals to the tail, and those wires were surviving the heat. The aircraft could still be flown, and it could even land itself, if only the crew could tune a radio and set up an approach they could not see. Then the captain lost his oxygen. The fire had eaten through the hose feeding his mask. To reach the spare bottle behind the seats, he had to pull off his mask and goggles, and breathe air laced with carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. He told the first officer to fly. The recorder caught him moving through the blackness, searching. His last words were that he could not see. He was almost certainly dead before the aircraft came down. The first officer was alone now. He had 77 hours on the type. He could not read his instruments, could not tune his radio, and had no working elevator cables. He could not even speak to Dubai. Bahrain relayed his words through passing airliners, who passed them along again, and every answer crawled back through the same chain. What the recorder captured over the next 15 minutes is among the hardest listening in aviation. He asked for his altitude, again and again. He asked which way he was heading and how fast he was going. He told them he was flying blind, that it was getting hot, that he needed to speak to someone directly. The replies came slowly, while he raced toward Dubai at 350 knots, far too fast for the autopilot to lock onto the landing beam. It never captured it. He overflew the airport at 4,000 feet with no landing gear, because the fire had taken that too. Steered toward another airfield, he tried to enter a new heading and, blind in the smoke, dialed in the wrong number. The aircraft banked away in the opposite direction. He disconnected the autopilot, and the nose dropped hard. He hauled back on a column that answered him faintly, or not at all, and that last, desperate pull lifted the aircraft just enough to carry it past the edge of a residential suburb before it struck a military base and broke apart. 29 minutes had passed since the alarm. Both pilots died. Nobody on the ground was hurt. Investigators found the crew had been beyond saving from the moment the first battery caught, and that no decision either man made could have altered the ending. Everything that changed came afterward, in the charge limits and packing standards that now govern every battery flown anywhere in the world. They exist because of two men in a burning aircraft over the Gulf, one of whom kept flying it long after there was any reason left to hope. Most of the people who died in this crash had never gone near an airport. They were asleep in their homes in a village outside Bishkek on a freezing January morning, or getting ready for work in the dark, when a fully loaded Boeing 747 came out of the fog and went through their street like a plow. 35 of them died. The jet belonged to a small Istanbul cargo carrier flying on behalf of a larger airline's freight division, painted plain white with one modest marking to say who operated it. 4 men were aboard, 2 pilots and 2 cargo staff, on a run from Hong Kong to Istanbul with a refueling stop in Kyrgyzstan. Both pilots were 59 and experienced with clean records. They had also been on duty for 11 hours by the time they neared Bishkek, awake far longer than that, and the entire flight had passed in darkness. Manus Airport was buried in freezing fog. That was not in itself a problem, because a 747 can land itself in weather like this, and the visibility sat just above the limit. The trouble began when the controller kept them high. The mountains east of the airport are enormous, and he could not bring them down any sooner. The captain took it badly. When his first request to descend was refused, he swore at the controller, and when they were finally cleared to lose 12,000 feet in 50 kilometers, he complained that they had been left high again. To come down that steeply, the crew needed to raise the speed brakes, panels on the wings that spoil the lift and let a heavy jet sink faster. The captain did not raise them. For reasons nobody has ever explained, he flew the whole descent without the one tool that would have solved the problem he kept complaining about. By the time he finally deployed them, there was no getting back onto the profile. They crossed one waypoint more than 3,000 feet too high, then the next one 2,000 feet too high. The first officer said aloud that they were going to end up high. The captain never answered. Neither man suggested the obvious remedy, which was to fly a circle and lose the height, or simply give up on the approach and come back around. Nearing the runway, they were far above the descent path, so far that their instruments could not lock onto the landing beam. The captain, growing more agitated, cursed the controller again. The first officer tried to calm him down. Then, 2 kilometers from the runway, the instruments came alive and announced that they had captured the glide slope. They had not. A landing beam bounces off the ground and throws up ghostly copies of itself at steeper angles, and the aircraft had flown into one of these false signals, tilted at 9 degrees. The autopilot obediently began a normal 3-degree descent. The signal disappeared within 2 seconds because descending at 3 degrees takes an aircraft straight out of a 9-degree beam. But the system waits 15 seconds before telling anyone, so as not to cry wolf over brief dropouts. For 17 seconds, every instrument in that cockpit agreed they were exactly where they wanted to be. That was all it took. When the alerts finally cascaded across the panel to say the signal was gone, neither pilot reacted, though the captain had stated in his own briefing that losing the beam meant abandoning the approach. Passing 500 feet, the aircraft called out a glide slope warning. Nobody answered it. At 200 feet, they overflew the runway itself, hidden somewhere below in the fog, and kept sinking toward the fields beyond. The captain told the first officer to look outside. The runway was already behind them. At 58 feet above the ground, he called for the go-around at last, and the autopilot began to lift the nose, and it was far too late. A wingtip caught a pine tree. The landing gear tore through the airport fence and a concrete wall. The jet touched a field and bounced, struck another wall, and went into the houses. It carved a path 7 blocks long, rolling onto its side and spinning as it went. 38 buildings came down, 26 of them, homes with families inside. A wheel from the landing gear burst through one house and took the wall with it. The 4 men on the aircraft died alongside the people below. The recorders told investigators something strange. Across the long flight from Hong Kong, this crew had followed procedure faultlessly. Then, in the final 10 minutes, they ignored their position callouts and their checklist. They ignored a cascade of alerts. They ignored a warning shouted by the aircraft itself and flew below the height at which they had promised to stop. Exhausted and desperate to be on the ground, they had seized on every scrap of evidence that the landing was going well and quietly set aside everything that said otherwise. The human brain does this to itself, and the trap has a name: confirmation bias. They never lost control of that aircraft. They lost their grip on where it was, and the machine carried them into a village while assuring them, until the final second, that it was about to land. By the time this aircraft lined up on the runway at Halifax, 2 of the men aboard had been on duty for 45.5 hours. Not flying that whole time, but working, awake, snatching sleep in a bunk behind the cockpit while the jet crossed the world beneath them. Their employer had no duty limits for them at all. The pilots had been at it for 19 hours, which was also perfectly acceptable under company policy. It was almost 3 in the morning. The airline had been founded by a Zimbabwean businessman and registered in Ghana, with offices near Gatwick and aircraft scattered across 4 continents. It was growing furiously and had built its reputation on getting the freight through no matter what. Delays were absorbed by keeping the crews awake longer. A 4-sector trip like this one was scheduled at 24.5 hours of continuous duty, beyond even the company's own generous rule, and delays that day had stretched it further. Hours earlier, the captain of the outbound leg had filed a written complaint about exactly this, asking whether anything could be done about the delays and the impossible shifts. He was asleep in the crew rest area when the aircraft rolled. In Halifax, they had taken on several thousand kilograms of frozen lobster and a full load of fuel for the Atlantic. The Boeing 747 now weighed 353 tons. On its previous takeoff, hours before, it had weighed 240. Someone then went to the laptop behind the cockpit to work out the takeoff numbers. The software could calculate anything a pilot needed and had been installed only months earlier. Buried in its design was a trap nobody in the company appears to have understood. If you opened a certain window to check the weight and balance and then closed it, the program silently copied whatever weight sat in that window into the field used for the takeoff calculation. It gave no warning that it had done so. The weight sitting in that window was the weight from the last departure. Whoever used the program that night closed it, pressed calculate, and the machine dutifully produced takeoff figures for an aircraft 113 tons lighter than the one waiting outside. The numbers copied onto the paper card were catastrophic. The engines were set for a reduced power takeoff, far below what a jet this heavy needed. The rotation speed was written down as 129 knots. It should have been 162. 2 separate checks existed to catch precisely this. The captain was supposed to re-enter the weight and run the calculation again himself. The crew were supposed to compare their figures against a table of rough values to see whether they made sense for the weight aboard. Neither was done. Nobody at the airline had been trained on the software beyond being handed a manual and told to read it. The program could even print its own card showing which weight it had used, which would have exposed the error at a glance, but the company preferred its own handwritten cards. At 2:53 in the morning, the throttles came forward and the 747 began to roll. In the darkness, it would have been very hard to feel that the acceleration was wrong. 5,500 feet down an 8,800-foot runway, the airspeed reached the number on the card, and the pilot pulled back. The nose came up. The wheels stayed on the ground. At 353 tons, 129 knots simply was not flying speed, and with the engines throttled back, the jet could not gather what it needed before the pavement ran out. With 800 feet remaining, someone hauled back so hard that the tail struck the asphalt and dragged along it in a river of sparks. 2 seconds later, the throttles went to full power. Engines take time to answer. The main wheels lifted as the runway ended. The tail did not, scraping through the grass with the nose pointed uselessly at the sky. 1,100 feet beyond the pavement stood an earthen berm supporting the landing system antennas, built the year before and entirely legal. The tail struck it and was torn away in one piece. The rest of the aircraft flew on for a moment, with nothing left to hold it up, then went nose first into the forest and broke apart in flames. All 7 men aboard died on impact. The voice recorder was found melted. The data recorder survived to confirm what everyone suspected, that the engines had been set too low and the aircraft rotated too slow, and that nothing whatsoever was wrong with the machine. When investigators went through the airline's crew logs, they found that 71% of duty periods had been scheduled beyond 24 hours, and that once actual flying time was counted, 95% of them ran longer than a full day. The complaint filed hours before the crash was answered by nobody. The safety board's report made a single recommendation, and it concerned takeoff warning systems rather than the hours those men had been kept awake. The airline rejected the findings entirely. It went bankrupt 6 years later. There is no recording of what happened aboard this aircraft. The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder went into the East China Sea with everything else and were never found, despite years of searching. Everything known about the last 18 minutes of these two men had to be assembled from twisted pieces of metal dragged up off the seabed, and from a handful of radio calls that other pilots relayed for them because nobody could hear them directly. The aircraft was 5 years old, a Boeing 747 freighter that lifted out of Incheon a little after 3 in the morning on the short run down to Shanghai. 2 pilots sat in the cockpit. Behind them, on the main deck, sat 58 tons of freight, most of it semiconductors and consumer electronics bound for Chinese factories. Among that cargo were 3 pallets of dangerous goods, and they had been stacked together near the rear cargo door. One held 18 lithium-ion batteries wrapped in polystyrene and plastic. Another held hundreds of liters of flammable liquid that would give off vapor at little more than the temperature of a warm afternoon. Nothing in the regulations forbade putting them beside each other, and so nobody had. The main deck of a freighter this size has no fire suppression system worth the name. There is no way to flood it with gas and hold a fire down. The only tool the crew has is to shut off the airflow and open the aircraft to the outside, starving the flames of oxygen at altitude. Against burning lithium, which makes its own oxygen as it goes, that is close to useless. 50 minutes into the flight, cruising at 34,000 feet, the fire warning came. The captain radioed Shanghai to say he had a fire on board and asked to descend and turn back toward Jeju Island. Nobody knows what he saw or smelled, or how long the fire had already been burning behind him. What is certain is that from that moment, he had less than 20 minutes. The controllers could barely reach him. As the aircraft descended, the radios began to fail, and Shanghai had to ask 2 nearby airliners to relay messages back and forth. The 747 came down toward 8,000 feet, then did something strange. For the next 9 minutes, it climbed and fell and climbed again, rising almost to 15,000 feet before dropping away once more. That was the fire eating the aircraft from the inside. It burned through the cabin ceiling and into the air conditioning ducts that run the length of the fuselage, filling the cockpit with smoke. Explosions in the cargo tore open the fuselage and sprayed debris across the right wing. In the tail, the heat destroyed the control components that the pilots needed to hold the aircraft steady, and the 747 began to slip beyond anyone's ability to fly it. Their last calls said the vibration had become severe and that they were losing control. At 11 minutes past 4 in the morning, in a steep descent through 4,000 feet, the aircraft stopped answering. Parts of the fuselage had already separated in mid-air. What remained struck the sea 130 kilometers west of Jeju. Finding it took months. The wreckage lay scattered across a patch of seabed several kilometers wide, in water 80 meters deep, and the currents and the weather beat back one search after another. In late October, 3 months after the crash, a salvage company located the shattered cockpit. The 2 pilots were still inside it. The investigation that followed was among the hardest in Korean aviation history, and it took 4 years. With no recorders, investigators laid out every recovered fragment and read the story in the scorch marks. They concluded that the fire had begun on or very near those pallets of dangerous goods, though they could never determine exactly what set it off. Once it started, the batteries and the flammable liquid fed each other, and the fire escaped anything the aircraft or its crew could do about it. 2 findings sit uncomfortably beside that verdict. The Airlines Flight simulator for this aircraft type was configured as a passenger jet, which meant no pilot who flew its freighters had ever practiced fighting a fire on the main deck. And the manufacturer had a recommendation for exactly this emergency: to open the hold to the thin air above 25,000 feet and smother the flames. But it was only a recommendation, and it was never written into the manual, so almost nobody trained for it. 2 men flew into the worst night of their lives, carrying knowledge that had never been given to them. Look at how few people were aboard these aircraft. 2 in one cockpit, 3 in another, 7 in a forest outside Halifax. These are among the smallest numbers in all of aviation, and that is exactly the problem. When an airliner full of passengers goes down, the world stops. Families wait in a terminal for someone who will never walk through the door, and newspapers and politicians and inquiries pile onto the industry until something changes. That pressure is what has made flying as safe as it is. It is relentless, and it is public, and it does not let go. A freighter has none of that. When one comes down in the dark, the 2 or 3 people aboard are the only ones lost and the only ones who could have explained what happened. Sometimes, even that is taken away. One of these aircraft carried its recorders to the bottom of the sea, and they were never found. Another produced a report the world was not allowed to read for more than a decade. The investigation ends quietly, and nobody marches. Now look at what actually brought these aircraft down. None of it was exotic. A pallet was turned sideways so it would fit, and a weight from an earlier flight was left sitting in a box on a laptop screen. A connector pin was reseated on an instrument that had never been faulty. Batteries were stacked beside cans of solvent because no rule said they could not be. Crews flew, who had been awake longer than the flights they were operating. Every one of these failures was cheap to prevent, and in almost every case somebody had already seen it coming. A complaint had been filed, or a warning had been filmed, or a fault had been written plainly in a technical log. It changed nothing. The reason is unglamorous. Asked why nobody had looked closely at a freight company that was loading its jets wrong, an aviation inspector explained that as far as his agency was concerned, cargo was just cargo. Cargo is not just cargo. It is the phone in your pocket and the parcel on your doorstep. The batteries that filled a cockpit with smoke over the Persian Gulf are the same batteries in the device you are holding right now. The boxes that went into a Texas bay were somebody's order, shipped overnight and never delivered. This is the trade that keeps the modern world stocked, and it moves at night because that is when the rest of us are asleep. When it goes wrong, it does not always stay in the sky. A man was sitting in his parked car outside a shopping center in Miami on his lunch break. A village outside Bishkek was asleep in the fog when a jumbo jet came down through it, and 35 people there never woke up. 17 of them, children. None of them had anything to do with aviation. They lived under the flight path, and that was enough. Here is the part worth holding on to. Almost every safeguard protecting a passenger flight today was written in the wreckage of a freighter. The strict rules on how batteries may be shipped exist because of a burning aircraft over the Gulf. The scrutiny of a pilot's employment history exists because of a cargo jet in a Texas estuary. The freight world takes the risk first, quietly, without an audience, and the passengers who never think about any of it inherit the lessons. There is no comfortable way to end this. Above the clouds and above your roof tonight, several hundred freighters are crossing the dark, each with 2 or 3 people aboard, carrying your life to you piece by piece. Whether they arrive depends on a paper card filled in correctly, and on somebody deciding that a shipment can wait until morning. Almost always it holds. This video is about the nights it did not. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.